welcome. So, I thought it'd be fun to talk about a greenhouse gas that we've been discussing in class, and one of the main atoms that composes it, carbon. I made this little, cartoon, so that's fun. So, and look at this. This is like zooming in and out. That's fun too. So this is education made interesting, right? So anyway, we're going to be talking about the path of carbon through the environment and what might happen to that carbon atom and how it is actually incorporated into CO2, which is generally found in the atmosphere in relatively low amounts. We talked about the fact that the atmosphere is mainly composed of nitrogen with oxygen, and then less than 1% is actually a number of gases, and one of those actually includes carbon dioxide. And you can see here that carbon dioxide is not just carbon alone. There's carbon. Carbon is a specific atom. Okay. Carbon dioxide has 2 oxygens with it and a carbon. So this molecule containing 2 oxygens and 1 carbon can be in the atmosphere, and it can be in the atmosphere for a very long time, but if it so happens to get too near a tree, it might actually be sucked in by that tree. And so what we're going to have here is that the CO2 is going to end up getting too close to a leaf of a tree, and it's going to be soaked into this oak tree here. Okay. The CO2 can be taken in by the leaf, and through a process of photosynthesis done inside of the chloroplast within the leaves, this green weird structure, the carbon dioxide that we talked about just a second ago, there it is, right? Goes into the leaf, and then it will actually be split during photosynthesis. Here is our carbon, and then there are the oxygens right there. So after being split during photosynthesis, who knows, our carbon atom will end up in this sugar molecule that was created by the chloroplast. Okay, so what used to be once part of the air, a gas, is now actually part of a sugar. Now, and who knows where those oxygens go? They could end up here, but they could also be puffed out as some oxygen gas that someone else breathes in. So you can see these atoms are really getting around here. And this sugar, let's say that the carbon atom just joined in, it is maybe used with a bunch of other glucoses to make this molecule right here, which is actually a large molecule called a starch. And so the sugars are taken and chained together to make a starch. And here is our carbon, once part of the air, now part of this starch molecule. And let's say that starch is incorporated inside of an acorn within that oak tree. And that acorn is it's kind of like it's the oak tree's baby. So that's like, that starch is its food for the oak tree baby. And so that carbon atom may be used to make a new oak tree, to help fuel that oak tree baby. Now technically, the oak tree baby is actually inside the acorn, and most of the acorn is just those starches that we talked about for feeding the oak tree baby. But sadly enough, sometimes the starches that were meant for the oak tree baby are eaten along with the oak tree baby by some evil herbivore. Like this guy. Most definitely a baby eater. Just look at him. So he has the acorn, the oak tree's baby, but more importantly, he has our carbon atom. And when he eats the baby, right, took a big bite out of that acorn right there, the carbon is now in his mouth. So that carbon that was originally part of a gas molecule, invisible, can't see CO2 gas, that carbon then went into a squirrel, and that carbon atom will be swallowed, and it will go into the squirrel's stomach to be turned into something else. So that carbon was a gas, and then the plant used it to make a starch and stored it in an acorn, and now it is part of maybe a fat cell inside of that squirrel. So the squirrel constructed a fat cell. This is what it looks like. Yeah, that's fat. Fat is called adipose tissue, and it actually has like a drop of oil inside of it. It's a gross looking thing. These are some nice, this is a great visual here. Got some blood vessels here surrounding the adipose tissue. So yeah, the carbon atom that was taken in by that squirrel is now part of this fat cell right there. And of course, we don't make fat without reason. The squirrel made fat because in the wintertime it's going to go through a hibernating like state where it's not technically hibernation, but it's like sleeping extremely heavily. And the squirrel will very rarely go outside for food and forage and all that type of stuff. Most of the time, the squirrel's actually surviving off fat that it got in the fall by eating things like acorns. So that is why the carbon is now inside of a fat cell, because the squirrel made the fat so it could have energy during the wintertime as it does this semi-hibernation thing. And the squirrel, when it breaks down the fat, it's doing cellular respiration, and cellular respiration is done inside of a mitochondria, which is a type of organelle inside of both plant and animal cells. And what will happen is that carbon, after being broken down along with the rest of the fat to make energy, it will now be respired or breathed out after it combines with two oxygen molecules. So that carbon has been by itself most of the time. There it is. It was paired with some other things. Not totally by itself. I mean, it had different partners throughout this entire process. In the fat cell, it is part of a fat cell, but after it is included in cellular respiration to make energy, it is paired with two oxygen molecules, and it is paired up with its friends from the beginning of this episode. And as you guys hopefully know, what we do with CO2 is we breathe it out. So this squirrel now breathes out CO2. So it originally entered the picture. Our carbon molecule was paired with some oxygens, right? And now we've come full circle. It's almost like a cycle, right? Into the tree, and into an acorn, right? And then into a squirrel. And now the carbon finally completes the circle as CO2 once again, as it is breathed out while this lazy acorn-eating squirrel is just hanging out during the wintertime. And of course, CO2 is not just emitted by lazy acorn-eating squirrels. Any animal releases CO2. And what you just saw, plants release CO2. Also, by the way, we'll talk about that later. But what you saw was just one cycle of many that carbon will take. It can go into CO2 and be up in the atmosphere, but carbon can also be part of other things. When it's part of CO2 in the atmosphere, it is a greenhouse gas, which means it traps heat, which isn't, of course, a bad thing. It's actually really good that CO2 is up there. It's like a blanket keeping us warm. If there was no CO2 and no greenhouse gases, the Earth would become a giant snowball, and we would all be dead. So CO2 is pretty good, but too much CO2 is not. And so we want a regulated amount of CO2 in the environment. This, with CO2 up in the air, and then it goes into a plant, then an animal, and it goes back, that's fine. That's not really adding any CO2, any carbon to the environment. It's just recycling it. It's just the carbon cycle. Well, the problem is now we are taking carbon from underground in the form of fossil fuels. This carbon has been stored there for a very long time, and it is in the form of oil and natural gas and coal, and we burn these, what are called carbon sinks. So these places where carbon can be stored. We burn the coal, we burn the oil, we burn the natural gas, and that puts carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And that carbon dioxide will once again make the planet warmer and warmer. So, in the next movie, you're going to see how CO2 and carbon has been trapped underground and how that happened. How did it get there in the first place? And hopefully you'll understand a little more about how burning gasoline and burning coal is adding CO2 to the environment and how that has to do with climate change. Okay. So, till the next episode.